Paul's story was simple. Lisa wasn't happy and wanted to end the relationship. She made it home from work and the two got in an argument. Paul went out for a drive to give her time to think. When he returned an hour later, Lisa had packed her things and left. But detectives suspected Paul knew more than he was telling them. His story wasn't consistent and the details weren't adding up, so they questioned him.
Yeah, but the problem is you're saying what you know, yet your story's changing a couple times. That's what's...
My story hasn't changed.
Well, things...
How has it changed? It's changed. And then there's the fact that your story isn't consistent.
How has it changed?
Well, did you stop by work at all last week? No, I didn't. I called in sick.
You want so bad to talk. I can see it in your eyes already. You know her better than us.
Let me tell you something. I live a simple life, right? I don't really mingle much with people. I don't interact with my friends at work. I don't have friends that she has. If the friend who's in the children was here, I know I can run there, see if she's there. I don't know any other friends other than that. That's what I'm saying. You think it's easy sitting here trying to find answers to questions that you don't know? I mean, come on, it's not.
I think it is. If he's not asking you hard questions. He's asking you, what did you do a certain day?
I'm talking about, no, which in mindset asking questions, if she's all right, where she is.
Paul wasn't budging, even when the detectives pointed out inconsistencies in his story and told him they'll need to verify everything he said.
I understand what you're saying. I have a problem with that.
Well, eventually you could have a major problem with that. It's called murder.
Murder is exactly what detectives were beginning to suspect. Already, just a week into the search for Lisa, there was evidence that she hadn't simply packed up and left. There were drops of blood found in the bathroom of Lisa and Paul's small apartment on Venetian Street in Miramar. It was on a vanity in the bathroom, and on the tiles in the tub, and on the door frame. Another drop was found inside a rental car that Paul was using around the time that Lisa was last seen. Detective Danny Smith says there was no way to know if the blood was hers. With Lisa missing, there was none of her DNA to compare it to.
We had none of her property. We couldn't use a toothbrush. We had no hairbrushes. We had no samples that could possibly have Lisa's DNA on them.
But they did have a close comparison, something that could at least tell them if they were on the right track. Lisa had a teenage daughter, Serlene, and her DNA could be analyzed for similarities. If the genetic makeup was close, the blood evidence could be linked to Lisa. Serlene had just turned 18, and she and her younger brother were living with Lisa's mother on the Caribbean island of Trinidad. But as luck would have it, when detectives went looking for a sample of her DNA, Serlene was in the United States, visiting family in Philadelphia.
So at that point, we contact other members of the family. We contact her daughter, who is visiting in Philadelphia. We get detectives in Philadelphia to meet with her and take swabs, DNA swabs from the daughter. They do the evaluation of the daughter's swabs, and they get a DNA profile. From there, we have to take those results to another doctor who specializes in population genetics.
Serlene's DNA profile was compared to the profile from the blood found in Lisa's bathroom and in the rental car. It's a near-perfect match. Whoever the blood belonged to was all but certainly a relative of Serlene. The probability was 99.999%. It had to be Lisa's blood.
So we're kind of looking at the right track in terms of, we know that we have a family member, and we know that Serlene has no other family members in the state of Florida.
And there was also somebody else's DNA in the samples. An unidentified male had left blood in the bathroom and on a mop. But by itself, this didn't prove anything. Maybe there would be more hope for finding Lisa by solving the biggest mystery of the whole case. Lisa's family and friends had started getting strange text messages from her almost as soon as she went missing. Her friend Richard Moore got one the next day. He couldn't remember what it said, but he did know it was unusual. It was the first time she had ever texted him. And Lisa's brother, Dexter Vincent, had also been getting messages from her. They were riddled with spelling errors and were confusing, almost nonsensical. Richard and Dexter were convinced that it wasn't Lisa who was sending the texts. And detectives working the case didn't think so either. Whoever was sending the texts from Lisa's phone was making mistakes. One message to Dexter claimed that Lisa was in Jacksonville, but her phone was being read by towers about 300 miles away near Miami. In another text, the name of Lisa's daughter was spelled wrong. And that wasn't all. Detectives examining records discovered that Lisa's phone was never very far from the phone owned by Paul Edwards. They were often sending signals to cell towers near one another. There could only be one explanation, detectives thought. It was Paul who was sending the text from Lisa's phone.
Supposedly, Paul is either receiving or sending texts to Lisa. Looking at it from an investigator point of view, I look and say, he probably has both phones in the car with him, and he's just making these texts himself.
But if Paul was doing it, why? Detectives believed they knew the answer. They just needed a way to prove it. So they came up with a plan to turn the tables on Paul Edwards.
Just a brainstorming session, sitting around saying, I don't know, what do you think? Shot in the dark for this? No, that's not going to work. How about this? No, that's not going to work. This is brought up. I said, all right, well, let's see if legally if we're allowed to do it.
It was a plan so bold and unusual, detectives didn't even know if it was legal.
No one in our unit has ever done it, and I believe even some members of the state attorney's office were a little taken aback by it because it was not a common request.
The plan was brought to a judge who gave it a green light. There was no guarantee it would crack the case, but detectives needed to try something. It was going to be a complicated operation that required some technological magic, multiple police agencies, and lots of patience. But the premise was simple enough. Detective Smith was going to pretend to be Lisa, and Paul was about to hear from his missing girlfriend. Felonious, Florida is brought to you by Simply Safe Home Security. Simply Safe is a fantastic security system providing great protection for your home. But before Simply Safe, home security companies were getting away with a lot. They were overcharging for outdated, complicated systems and trapping people in pricey contracts. That changed 10 years ago when an electrical engineer named Chad Lawrence had a few friends who were burglarized. They wanted security, but there weren't any good options. So Chad started Simply Safe. He got rid of the hidden fees and contracts. He made Simply Safe intuitive and easy to use. He just wanted a security company that treated people right. Now, Simply Safe is the top choice security system of CNET, PCMag, and Wirecutter. But most importantly, over 2 million people trust it to keep them safe. All because Chad wanted to help his friends who were burglarized. Go to simplysafe.com/Florida to get yours today. That's simplysafe.com/Florida. Detectives believed Paul Edwards had been sending text messages from the phone of Lisa Spence, who had been missing for nearly a month. But how will he react if he gets a text from Lisa too? They decide to find out. They don't have Lisa's phone, but they aren't going to need it. All they need is a phone that's been programmed with her number. Basically, a clone.
We come up with the idea to text Paul from a phone that we purchased that would look like it came from Lisa. I completed a court order, and I asked for the personal telephone information from Lisa Spence. Now, we didn't have her phone, so we had to go through the phone company to say, what's basically the ID number for her phone, give that to us, transfer it to this particular phone that we bought.
They had permission from a judge, and now they had a phone that was programmed with Lisa's number.
And then it was a matter of just logistics. How are we going to do this? We're going to call them. Do we send them a text? Do we do surveillance? How are we going to work this?
They decided a text message was the best option. But what would it say? And how do they make it sound like a message Lisa would send? It had to be genuine.
Upon speaking with her friends and family, they all say she never texts. If she does, it's very quick. She, I asked how she speaks normally, person to person, and how she speaks on text or on phone. And they said that sometimes she'll get words wrong.
So it would have to be short, and it would need to have a mistake, a grammatical error, or a misspelling. He settles on 6 words and plots out the rest of the operation. On Thursday, November 5th, 2009, it's showtime. It's a massive surveillance operation. Nearly every detective on the Miramar force is involved. The county sheriff's office and the U.S. Marshal Service are assisting. An airplane circles overhead, equipped with infrared sensors and capable of taking images from the sky. They suspect Paul is at the home of his mother and stepfather, just a half mile from the apartment where he lived with Lisa.
I knew the car he was driving, and I knew that he was staying with his parents. So we set up on his parents' house, assuming that he was there. It was a big assumption. So I was worried in the sense that we're sitting on the wrong house. He's driving around somewhere, and we have no idea where he's at.
They take a gamble and set up the surveillance on Paul's mother's house. If he's there, they'll be ready to track him the moment the text message is sent. From the Miramar police station, Detective Smith types it into the clone of Lisa Spence's cell phone. "Just wait till I got better." It's simple, cryptic, and contains one error, got instead of get. He pushes send.
I could imagine when he saw that text, he pretty much freaked out.
The trap is set, and they watch and they wait.
Not knowing what Paul had done to Lisa, I figured one of two things could happen. One, he could get in his car and drive to where he possibly placed her. Or two, he'd pick up the phone and call me and say, by the way, Lisa is not missing. She's fine. She just called me.
Paul didn't call Detective Smith. But after several hours, their gamble pays off. Paul finally steps out of the house and into the surveillance operation. He climbs into his mother's silver Toyota Camry and drives off. For the next 6 hours, police will track every move Paul makes. Reporter Juan Ortega describes the surveillance operation.
I was reading court documents about how the police wanted to follow Paul. It's clear that they're not skipping any step. They're going to make sure that they're not going to lose Paul. And they're talking about having 7, 8, up to 10 Miramar detectives ready to follow him. And even more than that, they have U.S. Marshals sitting in cars ready to follow Paul. And they also reach out to the sheriff's office, which has this, what they call a fixed wing aircraft, which was high tech, especially going back to 2009. This aircraft can reach high altitudes and still record video way down on the ground. So you come away knowing that once they see Paul, they're not going to lose him.
So I wish we could say it was like a Spielberg type of thing where we had, I would just touch something and the map would come up, but it was me with a laptop computer and Google Maps up and a radio. That was essentially it. But we were able to all communicate and follow him to where he didn't know that he was being followed.
Paul's 6 hours under police surveillance were seemingly random. He drives to several locations, stopping and then driving again.
And he went on maybe a 5 or 6 hour ordeal where he drove around to a bunch of different cities, stopped, came back home, went to a friend's house, drove around some more. And at the same time, we were either surveilling him or we had aerial support that was watching him. So we knew exactly where he was going, where he stopped.
As the day turns to night, he's not making it easy for police to keep up. They have no idea whether Paul even received the text they sent from Lisa's number. But he sure was driving as if he knew he was being followed.
And the way that Paul was driving that night was extremely erratic. We believed he was on what's called a heat run, which you believe that you're being followed by the police. So you make a bunch of turns, U-turns, go down dead-end streets and see if you're being followed. So without the cooperation of all those different agencies, we wouldn't have been able to follow him as well as we did.
Over dozens of miles and through several cities, Paul leads them from place to place. He goes to Aventura, near the senior living center where he works as a concierge, but he doesn't stop. He drives past the crowded, high-end Aventura Mall, but doesn't stop there either. He returns to Miramar, stops at a friend's house, then goes back home. Then he's on the move again, driving to another friend's house in Miami Gardens.
While he's doing all this, everyone's relaying back where he's at and giving information like, well, I just drove by some dumpsters. All right, make a note. Let's check that dumpster. Let's check this open field.
From Miami Gardens, Paul finally drives back to his mother's house and doesn't come back out. The surveillance operation ends at exactly midnight. Paul never responded to the text sent from Lisa's phone. Still, Paul's drive on November 5th seemed unusual, and detectives began the tedious task of retracing his movements. They searched every place he stopped. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but in this case, there were a lot of haystacks. They didn't even know what they were looking for. They canvassed empty lots and fields in Aventura and in Miramar. The search was turning up nothing. It took them weeks to move through all the places Paul stopped before making it to the last. Toward the end of the day, he had gone to the home of a woman he used to work with. She lived near 207th Lane in the Vista Verde Clusters subdivision in Miami Gardens. It was dark when Paul got there, but the aircraft flying overhead was tracking his heat signature into the house. His coworker had asked Paul to fix her stove. He stopped by 3 or 4 times in November and early December to work on it. Most of the times, she would call him on the phone or he would just call moments before to say he was coming over.
We didn't know anything about the residents or the resident. Ultimately, after the surveillance operation, we went back in our investigation and we stopped at every area that he stopped at or drove by. Any homes that he stopped at, we went and we spoke with them. And the people that we spoke to were very cooperative. The female in the area in Miami Gardens was very cooperative. She stated that Paul stopped by because he was going to install some sort of an appliance at her apartment. She thought it was weird because she had asked him to do this a while ago, and just out of the blue, he just happened to stop by. So that was one of the areas that we were concerned with, and ultimately the last area that we looked, obviously.
It's about a 10-minute drive from Paul's mom's place, and he stayed at the friend's house for just 9 minutes. Her house has a fenced-in backyard that abuts an open field next to a canal. She tells police that during one of Paul's visits, he had stood in her yard and asked if it was well lit at night. She told him it was. She had floodlights and security cameras. The field, however, is dark at night. The sandy grass lot is empty save for piles of debris, power lines, and clusters of trees. If you look to the east, Hard Rock Stadium, home of the Miami Dolphins, looms over the bank of the canal just 2 miles away. To the west, the canal disappears into a flat Florida horizon. Few people would have any reason to visit here. Perhaps occasional workers who show up to survey the land, cut the grass, or remove trash.
We tried a whole bunch of fields throughout Aventura, Miramar, Hollywood. It was time now to go to an area over by Miami Gardens where he drove to. Upon looking at it on the map, we noticed that by the C9 canal, there's a large area. It looks desolate. Let's go check it out.
It appears the whole surveillance operation will come down to this field. If police leave with nothing, it was a massive, wasted effort. The search dogs, Riot and Jewel, are sent out into the field, just like other dogs had been at locations Paul stopped on the night of the surveillance.
And this time it was a little bit different. The dogs picked up on a scent really quick, and they almost immediately were able to alert on a 55-gallon barrel that was pushed up against some trees.
Riot finds it first, but Jewel isn't far behind. These dogs are trained to signal or alert if they find the scent of a dead body. Given their reactions to the barrel, police are certain that's what they found.
So it's basically like a coated cardboard, but it has metal rings on the ends where you can actually make the barrel airtight. Well, it looked like it had been outdoors for a while. It was still intact.
A group of workers loads the unopened barrel into the back of a white truck and drives it to the medical examiner's office. There, it's carefully cracked open. The gruesome discovery inside officially turns the disappearance of Lisa Spence into a murder investigation. Detective Danny Smith hadn't known what to expect when he sent Paul the text from Lisa's phone. "Just wait till I got better." If Paul had killed Lisa, he certainly would have known he was being tricked, especially because of what had been done to her. The body had been in the sealed barrel, laying out in the open beneath the hot Florida sun for 2 months. It was badly decomposed. But there was no mistaking what happened to her. She had been stabbed more than 30 times. Her head was cut off and was missing. It was a brutal murder, and to Detective Smith, that probably meant Lisa knew her killer. It was somebody close to her.
I think it's safe to say that 33 times stabbing someone is overkill. The first person that you're going to look at is someone who's in a relationship with the victim, because that's a very intimate type act. And if a random stranger wants someone dead, they're normally going to stab them enough times to kill them, not overkill.
If this was the work of Paul Edwards, the text message could have frightened him enough to check the field where the barrel was found. And Detective Smith believes Paul did just that, waiting until the cover of darkness.
No, I don't believe he thought she was still alive. I'm fairly certain of that. I think that him leaving and driving to all these areas, possibly one, to make sure that he's not being followed until he ultimately goes to the area where she was dumped in Miami Gardens. And secondly, when he drives by Miami Gardens, I imagine he's probably looking for police lights, crime scene investigators, fire engines, something that would show, oh boy, she's been found. And I don't know what to do at this point. That's just my speculation.
There was very little doubt that the body found in the barrel was Lisa Spence. But the head was missing, and the condition of the body made it impossible to lift fingerprints. Detectives needed proof it was Lisa. Blood and tissue samples were sent to a lab for DNA testing. The condition of the body made even that a challenge.
One big step that took some time, actually probably took the most time, is identifying these remains as Lisa. Because the fact that the barrel was secured so well was good and bad. Good because it preserved everything where animals weren't able to get to Lisa. It actually preserved her body as it was. The bad thing is, because she was in that barrel for so long and it was close to airtight, the DNA in there degraded to the point where we were unable to get a DNA sample, we were unable to get a DNA profile. So it took multiple times of bone marrow and taking some of her femur and taking some long leg muscle. These are all parts of the body that hold DNA the longest. And it took having to go through basically everything that we could to get an accurate DNA profile.
There were also rings found in the barrel. One of them was a toe ring that was still on the body, and Lisa liked wearing jewelry. Detectives were traveling to Trinidad as part of the investigation to learn more about Paul and Lisa, so they used the opportunity to show a picture of the toe ring to Lisa's daughter, Serlene. The ring is unique, and Serlene recognizes it immediately.
And Serlene looked at it and said, that's my mom's toe ring. I know for a fact that's hers. So that right there was very important with one, being able to identify her, and two, for court purposes, saying we have a victim and this is our victim. That was one of many different little things that we were able to use to identify her.
Back in Florida, the identification gets stronger. The DNA from samples taken from the body in the barrel are compared to the DNA of Lisa's daughter. They're a close match, and an expert concludes the body was indeed Lisa's.
We're able to positively identify the remains found in the barrel as Lisa Spence. Obviously, you can imagine how important that is when it comes to trial. We can't have a trial for a homicide if we can't identify the victim. So that was very important.
Kessa George lives across the street from Paul Edwards and Lisa Spence on Venetian Street. She's lived there for about 10 years. She's friendly with Lisa, but barely knows Paul, who seems to prefer to keep to himself. 2 days after Lisa was last seen, Kessa is heading to church. It's October 9th, 2009, a Friday. She notices Paul is driving a new Toyota Highlander SUV. It strikes her that he's driving such a nice car and thought Lisa and Paul must be doing well. Kessa doesn't know the Highlander's a rental. She leaves for church at about 6 p.m. and returns at about 9. While she's outside talking to another neighbor, she sees Paul's white SUV backed up into a spot in front of their apartment building. It isn't how he usually parks. Then she sees Paul loading large garbage bags into the back. Based on how Paul was holding the bags, Kessa suspected they were heavy. At the time, she thinks maybe he's taking items down to Miami, where the annual Caribbean festival called Carnival is taking place that weekend. The next time she looks across the street, Paul and the SUV are gone. They're back the next morning, and this time the scene is even more suspicious. When Kessa wakes up Saturday, the sun had just come up. She looks through the blinds of her window and sees Paul's SUV is back, parked straight in, how it usually is. Paul isn't around, but the back door to the SUV is open, and Kessa sees a small, white cooler and a bag sitting inside. And there's a container sitting on the ground next to the SUV, waiting to be loaded inside. It's the barrel. And somebody else had actually seen the barrel inside Paul and Lisa's apartment. Police had learned that Lisa used it to ship items back to her children and family in Trinidad, 1,600 miles away. A friend, one of the few that Paul allowed inside his apartment, had seen it there.
According to Lisa's family and friends, it was very common for both Lisa and Paul to send back goods, clothing, maybe some food products to the family members that are living in Trinidad. And they use that barrel as basically the conveyance for all those goods. There was a very important witness. We were able to meet with a friend of Lisa's, and this friend is one of the few people that were actually allowed in the residence shared by Paul and Lisa. Evidently, Paul was very overprotective of his property, overprotective of Lisa. He didn't want her hanging out with anyone. But there are a couple of female friends that Lisa had that were allowed inside the house. This particular female remembers being in the home shortly before Lisa went missing and ultimately was killed. And she was inside the residence and remembered seeing a 55-gallon drum that's described exactly as the one that we found Lisa's body in.
Police were closing in on Paul Edwards. By January 2010, more than 2 months after Lisa's disappearance, Paul had hired a lawyer. And he would need one. Police suspected that the blood of an unidentified man that was found inside the Venetian Street apartment belonged to Paul. They needed proof, but hadn't found enough reason to convince a judge to order Paul to contribute a DNA sample for testing. With Lisa's body found, they had enough to get the warrant, and detectives headed out to swab Paul's mouth. On January 21st, Detective Smith knocks on Paul's mother's door.
Paul, you're on speakerphone with your attorney.
Let's do it.
Well, they have the option to take you in their police car,
Okay, no problem.
They'll take you in the police car, you know. They don't want you to drive yourself because they're allowed to do it that way, okay? Because they're really seizing your body to take these steps, so they're allowed to take your body since they have a search warrant. So they're going to take you to the police station, they're going to do it quickly, and then they're going to release you, take you home, and then you're going to call me, okay?
Yeah, no problem with that.
When the results of the DNA tests come back, it's looking bad for Paul Edwards. His blood matched the blood found in the bathroom, and it matched blood on the mop. Detectives believed it was used to clean up the murder scene. The dots had been connected. Police and prosecutors believed Paul attacked Lisa in their apartment, likely with a knife.
She had many defensive wounds on her hands, which obviously lends to the fact that we know it's very common for someone who commits a stabbing to actually get cuts on their own hands. The fact that he had cuts on his hands when we first spoke with him, another red flag. Interviewing his co-workers and friends, they say they met with Paul. They asked him why his hands were bleeding, or not bleeding, but why he had cuts on his hands. And he said, I was just cutting some chicken and I accidentally cut myself. Those are things that you don't cut yourself on the hands multiple times because you're cutting chicken.
He stabbed her more than 30 times, mostly in her chest, stomach, and arms. He removed her head and stuffed her body into the barrel Lisa kept in the apartment for shipping.
The reason that he did it, I don't know. He's a pretty decent-sized guy. He's strong. And I would venture to say that looking at the injuries of Lisa's neck, that a lot of what went towards the decapitation was probably just strong stab wounds. And it just kind of went from there.
He loaded the barrel into his rental SUV and dumped it in the field next to the canal. Despite extensive searches, Lisa's head has never been found. On April 14, 2010, Paul Edwards was arrested and charged with killing Lisa Spence. It took more than 5 years to bring Paul's case to trial, and it lasted for a month. But it took the jury just 3.5 hours to make its decision. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. Paul's lawyers noticed how nice he was to them. His demeanor didn't match the violent way Lisa was killed. Josie, Carey, and James represented him.
I remember when I first met Paul, I immediately liked him because he reminded me so much of my father. My father had just passed, this was in July, so my father had passed maybe 7 months before we tried this case in July of 2015. And so Paul reminded me so much of my dad, very straight-laced, very respectful. I think the entire time that I represented him, he only ever called me Miss James, never by my first name, because he just felt like I had a role in his life. I was his attorney, and I deserved the respect of the, last name with the title, which is something my dad would have done. My father was in the Jamaican Constabulary Force, so they had a lot of similarities. He was very straight-laced, very clean-cut. He was also a really spiritual guy. You could always find Paul quoting scripture or wanting to discuss some Bible verse that he had read, which was something that I liked because I'm a woman of faith, and so it was an immediate rapport with Paul because of that. The two things just didn't jibe to me. The way Paul presents and his demeanor that was unwavering the entire time that I interacted with him. And then the gruesome, rage-filled nature of this killing, they didn't seem to go together.
But the jury didn't agree. Terry Dahl is a 68-year-old hairdresser and grandmother of 6 who moved from Detroit to Florida in 1976. She was on the jury. Terry was convinced by all of the errors Paul had made after the murder. Leaving behind blood in the apartment and on the SUV, spelling Serlene's name wrong, the barrel, leaving his phone close to Lisa's when he was texting. And she believed Paul's background as a prison guard gave him knowledge for how to cover his tracks.
So how he could murder her like that and then cut her head off, and I think he cut her head off so it would be harder to identify her body if it was ever found. he knew how to try to get away with murder. So I'm glad, I'm glad he's in jail, and he deserves to be in jail. To me, he was guilty without a reasonable doubt.
The defense also argued that police targeted Paul early in the investigation and never looked into other possible suspects. Like the man Lisa was seeing behind Paul's back at the time of her disappearance, Shaquin Lopez. Shaquin had told police that he and Lisa were planning to run away together. They had even talked about getting married. And he was one of the last people to have seen Lisa alive. Paul's lawyers told jurors that Shaquin could be the one responsible for Lisa's death, so they weren't happy when they learned that Shaquin was missing. And they were even more upset when they learned, in the middle of the trial, that he was dead. In fact, Shaquin Lopez had been murdered. It was less than 2 years before Paul's trial. Shaquin was shopping at a Ross store in Miami Gardens, the same city where Lisa's body was found. As he and a friend left the store and headed toward their car, a man walked up to them, pulled a gun, and shot Shaquin in the neck, killing him. There were no surveillance cameras around. Shaquin's friend told police he recognized the gunman, but the man he identified had a strong alibi, and the charges were dropped. Phyllis Cook also represented Paul Edwards. She says Shaquin's murder came as a surprise to the defense team, and the fact could have strengthened Paul's defense.
We did not know he was dead. We did not know he was murdered. It just seemed a little bit suspicious to us that that particular case was not mentioned before. Certainly, I believe the jury should have known that he was, not just that he was deceased, as they believe, but that he had actually been murdered.
The murder of Shaquin Lopez remains unsolved today. Paul's lawyers argued that the police focused on Paul and did little to check out Shaquin's story. Detective Danny Smith says that's not true. They verified Shaquin's alibi and he was quickly ruled out.
We met with him and we were able to get his alibi for the time that we believe that she went missing and checked his cell phone records in comparison to the cell phone records that we had from Paul and Lisa, and they didn't match.
Ultimately, what brought down Paul Edwards was the same thing he used to cover up the vicious crime: a cell phone and its chilling text from the dead. Paul's lawyers say there's no way to know for sure whether Paul ever saw